So scientists think they found a hypothetical planet Y. Could this mean that we can shed some light on finding where planet X could be? Let's talk about it. So planet X sits about 700 astronomical units away from the sun, where that means put that in perspective of miles, because also planet X is very elongated, where its aphelion being its furthest point away, it's about 94.5 billion miles away. Now, being its perihelion being the closest point away from the sun, it's about 91.5 billion miles. So that means it's that 3 billion mile difference. Now, that's about 700 astronomical units away. So, an astronomical unit is pretty much the unit of distance that the Earth is away from the sun. Now, Neptune sits about 30 astronomical units away from the sun. To get to planet X is about 700 times the distance that Neptune sits away from the sun. So, yeah, let's put that in perspective, being the elongation. So, its orbital journey takes about 10,000 to 20,000 years to make one full trip around the sun. So, let's go over some history. Now, for thousands of years, we know how to map all the stars on our night sky. We knew how to look for food, hunt, look for water by using all the stars and we put it on a map. Over the course as technology evolves, we have things like boats, and we have communications. But remember, we didn't have satellites, we didn't have Google Maps. We had things like maps of stars. We had these little star charts to know where every constellation is, where every star pattern is. And we all know every other planet there is that's also aligned with these stars. Remember, no one ever knew how to discover a planet before. We already knew all the planets for right now because they were so known in the night sky. We knew Mercury. We obviously knew Venus being the daytime versus the nighttime star. We know Earth because we live on Earth. We know Mars. Also know Jupiter. We also know Saturn. We also know the moon. Also, we know the sun. Remember, at the time, when we thought of Earth being the center of everything, pretty much, it wasn't until Galileo determined that it was actually the other way around. So he was punished at the time for making these calculations that instead of Earth being the centermost of everything, well, everything else is in the orbits around the sun. So at the time, nobody knew how to discover a planet. Well, it wasn't until 1781 where we insert William Herschel. In the last couple nights, he was just observing with his telescope, and he was seeing something strange in the far abyss. A bluish, greenish dot just streaking across his lens. And he took it, and he went out again in a different night, and he sees this orbit going back again. What could it be? In bingo, on the night of March 13th of 1781, and mind you, this was the last 2 years of the Great American Revolution, where after the United States already gained its independence in 1776, and we're already still fighting that revolution, in 1781, in the last 2 years of the Great American Revolution, Uranus was discovered. So, years later, before we actually get to the discovery of the other planet, let's talk about what it's named. So, it wasn't actually called Uranus at the time. It was actually named after George. And by George, I meant King George III. It was named after William Herschel's predecessor. So, George's star. Now we can get into the future. Now we're going to go into about 60 years later, probably around the 1840s. So we're going to go into 1845. Urbain Le Verrier in France John Couch Adams in England, independently been calculating the position of this hypothetical planet based on the perturbations in Uranus's orbit. What could be disturbing Uranus's orbit? There must be another planet out there. All these calculations led up to a couple nights of 1846. On the night of September 23rd to September 24th, 1846, Johann Gottfried Gale, Urban Le Verrier, and John Couch Adams and other predecessors using this Fraunhofer telescope in Berlin, and they made the first observation of this bluish dot just streaking across. And with all those calculations are right, they just discovered Neptune. Neptune landed right there based on the calculations, based on math, using the Newton's laws and other calculations. Right there, Neptune, September 23rd, 1846. Within 1 degree of Le Verrier's predictions, mind you. Mind you, when Le Verrier took it to other processors out there, the acquaintances, they were like, dude, I'm sorry, man. This is wrong. It's in a degree of something wrong. Not knowing that it was 1 degree off. They discovered Neptune right there at that night where Neptune was landed. The processors didn't know that there was a planet that was laying in that 1 degree off of that calculation. Neptune was discovered. Crazy, right? Now, enter the 20th century, where this figure, Percival Lowell, his hunt for Planet X actually started in 1905, and it was called the Invariable Plane Search. Lowell and his small team of computers, led by head computer Elizabeth Williams, carried a series of calculations based on the observed orbit attitudes of Uranus, but also Neptune as well. Uranus and Neptune already been discovered years in the past. So with a basis of calculations and math, he set out for the great beyond. And he was searching through the areas of Newton's laws around where Uranus sits. And 1910, Lowell escalated his search after his former colleagues turned rival William H. Pickering published an orbit and position of a theoretical trans-Neptunian object. Lowell now saw his search as a race to beat Pickering and other would-be planet discoverers to the punch from 1910, and eventually Lowell died in 1916. He spent years and years and so many hours finding this hypothetical planet and rivaling with these scientists that are, they're leading him, in finding this hypothetical planet that it's lurking out there that doesn't follow Newton's laws either, and what could be protruding Uranus and Neptune. So Lowell died, unfortunately, in 1916. So he realized that his instrument was inadequate for the search because it was a too small a field of view. He purchased a new 5-inch brass hair telescope to continue his work. And like I said, during that time, there were rivals. But before he died, he basically gained a lot of money. His mathematical advantages led him to make millions. So he used those millions and he invested, and he set his sights on northern Arizona. He puts this new observatory with his new telescope up in the mountains, right around the developing city of Flagstaff. And this was called the Lowell Observatory, located in Flagstaff, Arizona, which actually is one of my bucket lists I want to go to. So now let's enter Clyde Tombaugh. So he's this amateur astronomer that is setting his sights on. He took about 6 nights in 1930 and During the course, he takes a picture of his findings as an object, a teeny tiny object that's just in different positions during those 6 days. He comes up with what is this object? How big is the object, and what's out there? So he names it Pluto. Um, yeah. When Percival Lowell's musings about theoretical ninth planet led to mathematical and photographic studies, so Tom Bell had this eureka moment for the last 6 days that he just discovered Pluto. And for years since then, from 1930, and people growing up from 1930 to 2006, where everyone thought that Pluto was the ninth planet, well, in 2006, Pluto was demoted as a dwarf planet because it didn't meet one out of the three criteria. One of the criteria was that the planet pretty much clear its neighborhood. Pluto does not, unfortunately. Pluto is so elongated it tips about 17 degrees outside the plane of the solar system, and it even crosses through the orbit of Neptune. So that's not very planet-like. So Mike Brown pulled the trigger and pretty much demoted Pluto as a dwarf planet, along with the icy Kuiper objects like Haumea, Makemake, Ceres, Eris. They're not planets anymore. They're dwarf planets because they don't follow one of the criterias, what becomes a planet or not. So that's where the obsession of Planet X really came from. But just because of Lowell's obsession with hunting for Planet X, it started in 1905, but the obsession with Planet X actually went further than that, about 300 years since then, since when the discovery of Uranus and eventually leading to the discovery of Neptune about 60 years later. And eventually, like I said, when Pluto was discovered, everybody knew that was it. Planet X was found. And then eventually, 2006, Pluto was demoted, and that's not the answer they were looking for. So Planet X is still out there. Nobody knew what this is. Nobody knew how far it is. Where is it coming from? So let's come up with a theory of Planet X. Why is it so far out where it sees little to no sunlight at all? Well, at one point, 4.6 billion years ago, Jupiter was formed, and then the sun grew. Now, you see, Jupiter was a wandering planet. It was a troublemaker. It was wandering where these hundreds of rocky planets that were being leveled and forming, and then Jupiter wandered. Its massive gravity disturbed all these little planets to the point that they were colliding, they were fusing, they were being flung away, they were getting captured, they were even getting forced into the sun. Now Saturn grew, and Saturn had enough gravity to do a resonance where it pulled Jupiter back in its orbit, but that sent a gravitational ripple where Planet X was right in the orbit of between Saturn and Uranus at the time. Now with that gravitational resonance and Planet X distance away from these two, well, as Saturn was pulling Jupiter, it caused that gravitational ripple where it basically took Planet X with that combined gravity of two planets, and Planet was chucked away out into the far abyss of our solar system, where that gravitational ripple as that Planet X was floating very fast to the outer far reaches of our solar system, where it's caused that gravitational ripple as it was moving pretty fast. It actually caused a gravitational issue where Uranus and Neptune, not once but many times, swapped orbits. They swapped places. And also, as it floated across very fast, it pretty much disturbed the orbits of the Kuiper Belt region, where it made these little planets that were forming the Kuiper Belts. They were getting disturbed because that's how they set up their orbits, and they can only grow to a certain size to the point where they said either probably they collided with something or something happened. So Planet X being chucked out caused a lot of destruction in the outer part of the solar system. Now it's so far away where it receives little to no sunlight. So that's the story of Planet X.